big battle of the war will take place on July 21st, 1861, Battle of Manassas. And it would be Colonel A.P. Hill, commander of the 13th Virginia.
Virginia!
Yes, the 13th Virginia. Many troops in that company came from Culpeper. Well, after Manassas and Colonel, he would go on in February of 1862 and be promoted to Brigadier General. And then a few months later, on May the 5th, at the Battle of Williamsburg, he would distinguish himself so much that he would be promoted to Major General. June 1st, 1862, Robert E. Lee assumes command of the Army of Northern Virginia. And A.P. Hill christens his new command the Light Division. It is the largest division in the Army, and he trains it for speed. Speed, get there in the right place at the right time. Yes, the Light Division. Well, there's a threat to the capital of the Confederacy, which is Richmond, Virginia. And everyone knows at that time, if Richmond falls, Virginia falls. If Virginia falls, the Confederacy falls. That threat is federal forces commanded by George McClellan. Well, there will be a series of battles known as the 7 Days battles, right around the capital. It was on to Richmond, that's what those federal forces would say. And then one of those battles would take place on June the 30th. Battle of Frazier's Farm. Yes, during that battle, A.P. Hill would be in his red battle shirt, and there would be a gap that would open, and it would make a gateway right to the Confederate capital there in Richmond. And A.P. Hill would be on his horse. He would grab a battle flag and wave it up, and he would cry out, "If you do not follow me, I will die alone!" And they followed him, and they closed the gap. One eyewitness saw A.P. Hill, they called him the God of War. And all this was being witnessed by President Jefferson Davis and General Robert E. Lee. You see, they wanted to go on the battlefield for a closer look, just to see what was going on with all the action. But artillery was falling around them. A.P. Hill saw them. He rode up and he started calling out to them, "General Lee, President Davis, I am commander of this part of the field. You must leave at once. Go to the rear." Well, President Davis and General Lee looked at one another. They smiled, and then they rode to the rear. But did they stay there? No. They kept firing. They kept riding, and then more artillery started going around them. A.P. Hill again would ride up to them. "President Davis, General Lee, if one artillery shell hit you, then this country would lose the President of the Confederate States of America and General Lee, our commander of the Army of Northern Virginia." Well, they did leave. And the battle ended, and so did the 7 Days battles, because George McClellan and the federal forces retreated back to Washington. Just think, ladies and gentlemen, what might have been, but because of the timely arrival of A.P. Hill, Richmond was saved, Virginia was saved, the Confederacy was saved, and let's not forget, President Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee were saved, thanks to the timely arrival of General A.P. Hill. Well, the war would go on, and there would be a battle not too far from here. Not too far, on August the 9th. Battle of Cedar Mountain. Yes, some people will call it Stonewall Jackson's victory, but no, it would be A.P. Hill's victory at Cedar Mountain, because he would save General Jackson. General Jackson, I know this is your birthday today, but we must give credit where credit is due. And it is General A.P. Hill's victory here at Cedar Mountain, not too far from Culpeper, his boyhood home. And the war continues on after that victory at Cedar Mountain. And then there would be the Battle of Second Manassas. at Second Manassas, A.P. Hill will hold the line. And it would be another great Confederate victory. But then there would be the capture of Harper's Ferry in the western part of Virginia. Yes, Harper's Ferry, that arsenal, a great Confederate victory by Stonewall Jackson and A.P. Hill. At that victory, there would be the capture of 12 Yankee prisoners, 13,000 stand of arms, 73 cannon, 200 wagons, all for the take. But General Jackson would ride off to Maryland, to Sharpsburg, to hook up with General Lee. But he would leave A.P. Hill behind to parole all those Yankees. But then early on the morning of September 17th, 1862, a courier would arrive to General Hill. General Lee needed him. General Jackson needed him. You see, throughout the course of that day, Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia would be being pushed back at the cornfield, at the Suckin Road, and at the lower bridge. But A.P. Hill in his red battle shirt, he will have his men, the light division, 5,000 men on the road, and with the point of his sword, he would keep moving and moving and moving, and men would start falling by the waysides. But no, he would have the 5,000 men on the road and kind of go through 17 miles in 7 hours just to get there. But there were reasons why he wanted to get there. Yes, he wanted to save General Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia, but there were other reasons. You see, he was not too happy to be being left behind paroling those Yankees. So he wanted to prove to General Jackson, yes, I saved you at Cedar Mountain. I am going to save you and the Army and General Lee at Sharpsburg. Also, there was another person that he was going up against. The commander of the Army of the Federals was George McClellan. It seems George McClellan and A.P. Hill were roommates at West Point. And believe it or not, ladies and gentlemen, they courted the same woman. And she ended up being engaged to General Hill. But then the engagement was broken off, and she married George McClellan. So A.P. Hill wanted to prove to Ellen Marcy who was the better man. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, one more reason why A.P. Hill wanted to get to that battlefield as quick as possible. He was going up against an old friend of his from the old army, General Burnside. General Burnside, a Yankee, A.P. Hill, a Virginian. Well, A.P. Hill, he came from merchants. He was wealthy at the time, but Burnside was a notorious gambler, and he borrowed $8,000 from A.P. Hill before the war, and he never paid him back. So, that was another reason why A.P. Hill wanted to get there. But now, he's getting closer and closer and closer. He would lose 500 men going over Bolton's Ford. But he would ride ahead, and Lee and Hill would embrace when they saw each other. And Robert E. Lee would give the directions to A.P. Hill for what part of the battlefield he wanted the light division to come. A short while later, a column of soldiers were coming closer and closer and closer. And Lee asked his aide, what flags are they flying? And his aide said, they are flying the Virginia and Confederate flags. And it was General Robert E. Lee who said, it is A.P. Hill up from Harper's Ferry. So that expression, up came Hill, became legend because A.P. Hill got to the right place at the right time and saved the Army of Northern Virginia. And as A.P. Hill would say, my men are allowed nobody to get by us. Our men, with a yell of defiance, made it to the battlefield not a moment too soon. Well, after the Battle of Sharpsburg, the armies would fight again at Fredericksburg on December the 13th. 1862, and it would be another great Confederate victory. But then you go into 1863, and then at the Battle of Chancellorsville, General Jackson and General Hill are reconnoitering the battlefield at night, and all of a sudden, there's a burst of fire. Jackson gets hit. A.P. Hill sees what's going on. He leaps off his horse, lies flat on the ground, gets up, he sees Jackson on the ground, and he goes up to General Jackson. And with General Jackson there, he takes off the blood-soaked gauntlets. He unbuckles the saber belt. He actually cradles General Jackson's head. And then General Jackson is being taken away by the stretcher bearers, and A.P. Hill will go to General Jackson. I will keep your accident from the knowledge of the troops. And Jackson says, thank you. That is the last communication between General Jackson and General Hill. So now, General A.P. Hill will command the 2nd Corps, but then he gets hit in the back of the legs. He cannot move. And Jeb Stuart, the eyes and ears of the Army of Northern Virginia, will command that 2nd Corps and win a great victory for Robert E. Lee. But that victory was costly. See, ladies and gentlemen, on May the 10th, General Jackson is dying from pneumonia. At 3:15 that afternoon. Yes, that's Sunday afternoon. Jackson always wanted to die on the Sabbath. General Jackson, his final words would be, "Order A.P. Hill to prepare for action. Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees." After the death of Jackson, A.P. Hill was promoted to Lieutenant General. General Ewell will be promoted to Lieutenant General. And now, with Lieutenant General James Longstreet, you had a 3-Corps Army of the Army of Northern Virginia going up north. Robert E. Lee wanted to put an end to this war. So on July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, at a little town known as Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, the war would rage for 3 days. A.P. Hill's men would attend the first day battle, and by doing that, he would win a victory. A small victory, but it was a victory. And the Yankees fled the town. But the war would go on, the battle would go on July 2nd. And then July 3rd, Pickett's charge. Yes, 2/3 of those troops belonged to A.P. Hill, the Pickett, Pettigrew, Trumbull charge. That day was the charge of the Confederacy going into the center of the Union line. But there were issues. So at the end of July 3rd, Robert E. Lee needed someone to bring the army back to Virginia. That evening, first, he would go to the tent of Lieutenant General James Longstreet. Then, he would go to the tent of Lieutenant General James Ewell. Finally, he would go to the tent of Lieutenant General A.P. Hill. Lee had to make a decision. His decision was to trust the Army, to lead the Army back home to Virginia, to General A.P. Hill.
Monuments for Dixie. Yeah, with the flags.
The next year, 1864, battle would rage
A
here
lot
in
of stuff he
Virginia.
does.
U.S. Grant will be the
I
new
don't know what
commander.
y'all think about
A.P.
him,
Hill will fight at the Wilderness
he
in May
seems to stand up.
of 64.
He
But
lives
June
6
the
miles
3rd,
from me.
Really?
June the 3rd, President Jefferson Davis's 56th birthday.
The
Robert E.
other guy's
Lee
out of New
and
Jersey.
A.P. Hill wanted to
know.
give the president a
Still
special
in New
gift.
Jersey.
Yeah.
They got Vinny.
Well,
Yep.
it seems there was a series of trenches designed by General Lee, and flanking those trenches was the artillery of General A.P. Hill. And when General Grant ordered his men to charge further and further and further, getting closer and closer and closer to those trenches, that's when A.P. Hill let loose that artillery. If you're familiar with Alfred Lord Tennyson's poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, you will know, while the men charge and Grant's men charge, A.P. Hill gave the order, cannons to the firing, cannons to the right of them, cannons to the left of them, cannons in front of them. Those Yankees were blasted away by the artillery of General A.P. Hill. It was a great Confederate victory. It was a victory as a gift to President Davis. Well, after the Cold Harbor, there would be a 9-month siege from June 1864 to April 1865. During that siege, every time those federal forces tried to break through, A.P. Hill was there. because he was the only person who General Lee could depend on. A.P. Hill was not well at this time, but he knew what was expected of him from General Lee. April 2nd, 1865. A.P. could not sleep. It was after 12 that morning. With him at headquarters, he had his wife, who was 7 months pregnant, and his 2 little girls were in the next room. But in the distance, he heard cannon fire, and he had to go to General Lee's headquarters. So instead of putting on his red battle shirt, he would put on a white linen shirt, which his wife had made for him. And then he put on his shell jacket, and then his cape.
Screenshot.
And in his pocket, he had the ham bone.
Screenshot button.
Yes,
What's up?
the ham bone. Home,
I was trying to take screenshots of the
family,
video.
Virginia. A.P. Hill would go over there. Lee's headquarters, General Longstreet would be there. General Hill would have his 2 couriers, Sergeant George Tucker, his chief of couriers, and Trooper Jenkins. But then there would be a break, and word got that A.P. Hill's section of the defenses was broken, and those Yankees were breaking through. And so A.P. Hill got in his horse Champ and started riding on the Boyden Plank Road, but just getting somewhat away from the headquarters. General Lee would cry out, "General Hill, take care of yourself." Well, it gets to be 5:30 that morning, and light is starting to shine through the trees. But still, General Hill has to get to General Heath's headquarters to rally the men. Maybe one last rally. But then they would see 2 Yankees on the road, and A.P. Hill and his 2 couriers would have their weapons drawn and command them to surrender, and they did. So those 2 Yankees would be brought back to be interrogated by General Lee. Trooper Jenkins would bring them. And so now it would be General Hill and his chief of couriers, Sergeant George Tucker. Now it got to be 6:15, and then they would spot a company of Yankees on the road. Too many for them to handle. So then by 6:30 that morning on April 2nd, they would ride through a wooded area. And for some reason, General Hill said to George Tucker, "If anything should happen to me, you must report it to General Lee." At precisely 6:30, going through that wooded area, they spotted 2 Yankees behind a tree. Those Yankees lifted up their .58 caliber Enfields. Those Yankees were Corporal John Mark and Private Dan Wolford of the 138th Pennsylvania. Hill, again with his pistol drawn, called out for them to surrender. But the 2 Yankees fired. The bullet fired by Wolford missed both Hill and Tucker. But the bullet fired by Corporal John Mark came towards General Hill, severed his left thumb. The bullet kept advancing into General Hill's heart, ripped through his heart, came out the back. General Hill was dead before he even hit the ground. But Sergeant Tucker remembered General Hill's last order. "If anything should happen to me, you must report it to General Lee." So Tucker would grab A.P. Hill's horse Champ and ride it to the headquarters. And then Lee knew when he saw Tucker riding A.P. Hill's horse. And when Tucker told the news of the death of General Hill, General Lee, as tears swelled in his eyes, and in a choking voice, he said, "He is now at rest, and we who are left are the ones to suffer." 1 week later, on April 9th, Robert E. Lee could no longer go on. General Hill and the Army of Northern Virginia was only a shell of its former self. So on that April 9th, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia. But that's not the end of A.P. Hill. 5 years later, on October the 12th, 1870, Robert E. Lee is dying from a stroke. and his family had gathered around him. And General Lee's mind was wandering back to the battlefield. And just before he says his final words of strike the tent, yes, General Lee called out. He needed a savior. And what did he call out for? What did he say? He said, tell A.P. Hill he must come up. Yes, even the animals knew. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is the fourth burial of A.P. Hill. See, what happened was that after he was killed, they wanted to bring him to Richmond, Virginia, and bury him in the place of heroes, Hollywood Cemetery. But the Yankees were going through the city. They were able to find a coffin, and you could not bury him in Hollywood. Then they wanted to bring him to Culpeper, here, his hometown, where he could be buried with his family, his mother and father. But Culpeper's over 100 miles away, and A.P. Hill is not going to be embalmed. So they decided to bury him on the 4th of April at a small cemetery, the Winston Cemetery in Chesterfield County. So he's buried there without any military honors. 2 years later, they move his body to Hollywood Cemetery on the side of a curb in Hollywood without military honors. Well, there is a push from Hill's men, the men of the Lake Division, the men of the 3rd Corps, to do something special for the general. It was the A.P. Hill Monument Association, and they raised enough money to erect a monument. In 1891, his body was removed from Hollywood Cemetery and brought to the base of this monument. No military honors, placing him on the ground at the base of that monument. Next year, on May 30th, 1892, with the monument completed, on that Memorial Day, 15,000 people showed up to honor General A.P. Hill. Yes, there were military services, but there weren't anyone they put on the ground 3 times altogether. But at that meeting, the 15,000, they heard a speech. The keynote speaker was General James A. Walker. And these were his words: wherever the headquarters flag of A.P. Hill floated, whether at the head of a regiment, a brigade, a division, or a corps, in camp or on the battlefield, it floated with a grace and a confidence and courage into the hearts of all who followed it. It was every advance, never nearest the enemy's lines, ever at the post of danger, always in the thickest of a fight, and trailed in the dust of fewer defeats than any flag in the Army of Northern Virginia. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, the most fitting eulogy was probably by Colonel Charles Venable of General Lee's staff. You heard these words earlier. You're going to hear them again. It's worth repeating. In him fell one of the knightliest generals of that